Hello, I'm Alexander, and this is a very spontaneous video after I recorded a similar one for my friends where I was touching into different topics and I was trying to capture the vibe of 2025 going into 2026 of what I consider a modern image, of what kind of visual reference or styles are actually trending right now, or more like what is appropriate to post, what kind of design is usually getting an attention, what is considered high craft. I do this mainly because my kind of day-to-day work became more and more businessy vibes, and I still want to pay respect to my older roots into the graphic design. And what I do yearly is I try to separate those kind of micro movements in visual trends to understand where things are going and what kind of visual tricks and decisions I can make, or what kind of research I should do to actually stay relevant across the time. So what I've tried to do here, I've tried to select multiple images from different sources, and I've tried to understand and kind of semi-group them between themselves to understand what looks nice today, what looks more polished today, what looks more professional, rich, well-designed, tasteful in the modern environment whenever I'm going to start on any new project. And mainly this exercise was like very self-driven, there is no structure, but I will try to kind of explain my way of thinking and why I think certain decisions work and why others don't. Okay, let's start from the center, because I actually moved from the center. I moved to like somewhere from here, and I started like, spiraling into these directions. So right now you can see there are almost like 4 to 5 directions in different styles, and I will try to kind of explain each of them, and I will try to kind of get a sense of why those directions exist and how they actually cooperate between each other. Okay, so I think the big theme that is visible across all mediums is the mixed media. So this is something where people are actually blending multiple techniques, multiple crafts between each other, and it gets more and more obvious of how it looks, of how it blends all together. And it's almost like a big sign that I see in almost like every visual work that was stunning this year, when the crafts were connected. Someone was generating a 3D object and putting it into photography. Someone was taking a photography and putting some kind of text or effect just on top of it. Someone was filming a video and then was applying some AI effects on top of it. And I started like literally seeing this everywhere, and I feel like I've never seen such like proliferation of the mixed media. I always was looking for the very polished photography or 3D renders or some kind of clean typography, text, web design. But right now it seems like if in order to stay relevant, you always have to mix. And you can see right now that people who are like working in fashion, they kind of apply different things on top of the faces. You can see that whenever the movie is being presented, they present it in a format of the video inside of the kind of, it's basically an OS inside of the video, inside of the different things that are happening there. Whenever people are posting some photos on Instagram, they're making almost like a kind of a statement there. They're putting some kind of text on top of it, which adds more meaning to the photo, because the photo itself is already quite good, but adding more layers of kind of meaning, of adding of other things, just amplifies this again and again. And once I started seeing this, and this is, by the way, not a new thing, it existed for centuries, but right now I feel like we were so oversaturated with different kind of polished media of one kind that we started like really blending them together and reaching new heights. You can see right now that even this wasn't like of this year's kind of production. I feel like it was like 5 years ago or something, but you can see how 3D rendering and kind of the landscape photography and the typography works here all together. And if you would remove one of those kind of objects, it would still look good, but it would not look complete. And you can see that many times right now, for example, in AI and in kind of different video editing tools. You can also see that there are different aspects where you are kind of trying to mix X-ray and video and photography, and the more kind of you zoom out, you see where it proliferates everywhere. You can see the different ads, you can see the different kind of web design merging with the kind of industrial design, you can see the superhuman merging different, even literally using different types of art on top of each other to kind of show how it works all together. And I feel like that's very, very kind of a sign of times almost. You can see that whenever people present some kind of font or some kind of design, they usually put it onto something, into some shape of something else. It's not enough to just type a text anymore. It's more like you have to extrude it. It's more like you have to put it on something. And it's not just a mock-up. It's not text put in like somewhere on the media format and it's just like in a fake photo. No. The content itself should take another shape of another craft. In this case, you can see that, for example, this one literally takes the shape of the 3D, but it still is a font by itself. It's not like a mock-up, and maybe if it is, it's still not like a very generic mock-up of like something just standing on the street, and it's still kind of a flat image. And the more you go into it, the more you see that, it's proliferated everywhere. You can see that the digital design is kind of merging with this paper formats, and it suddenly feels like home. It suddenly feels more modern. It suddenly feels like, oh, this is more sophisticated rather than one. I feel like AI is actually also part of this, because AI is kind of saying, okay, I'm very good at one craft. I kind of learn 3D rendering. I can render it without real 3D engine. But then by mixing media is something where actually AI kind of lacking itself. Like it will struggle to do both 3D and a paper post-it notes onto the same thing. Yes, you could kind of prompt and twitch it, but it's even hard. It's 3 times harder than doing them kind of separately. So it's kind of like almost requirement right now to mix media to perform that uniqueness that you want to see. And you see that a lot, like, like for example, even the Kurzgesagt's like thumbnail videos became way more harder to do. They used to make like super simple like vector shapes, but right now you can see that they're really starting to do like different things of like 3D and harder composition and the contrast. It's really getting different. You can see even like this was one of my favorite posters of the recent like Black Mirror movie, and the idea of them kind of extending it, and I really love this poster because it was about the server, the cloud in the air, and the way this person is not falling but actually being uploaded to the top. I feel like it's just beautiful. And again, they're mixing the graphic design, the photography design, and also kind of, something like a stretched marks of like almost like a scanner, or like there's a proper name of this technique. But it feels like mixing those different medias actually makes sense. And I see more and more of these things happening even inside of, some images. For example, here, this is obviously using the pattern generator, might be actually in Figma even. And then this is probably a hand, like vector shaped drawn kind of different lines. And again, this is an example of, you can see this grid applying on top of the image, and it's not something that we used to do for many years. It was like a style maybe 15 years ago where we were using like the physical mediums to perform like that. But right now it's very rare that we were having this design, but right now it kind of has its renaissance. And we can see more and more, like for example, for this, I think it was called Alma or Alta or something. I think Alma. And the idea of this app is that the idea behind this design is that they were AI generating different photos, but they were applying those different cutouts of the ingredients behind it. And I feel like it was quite thoughtfully made, but I also kind of have to acknowledge that this is yet again another mixture of media. The same as X-ray effects that were very popular in design, or these kind of photos where someone takes a very emotional photo and then you just draw a little border that kind of reminds you a CCTV camera. I feel like that's yet another thing, and we see more and more of those examples that are posted every day where you can see that the real sticky notes, everything is being applied on the kind of digital medium, which makes this kind of illusion of like, hey, it's more tactical than it's used to be. And we can see that more and more happening across the line, and maybe in different mediums that I'm going to touch, they're also going to be visible. I think one other thing that is becoming more and more prominent is the glow. I think glow was like very, it went through stages. It was very kind of kitschy back then it had its own mini renaissance with Photoshop, then we had like a really vector graphic thing, and glow died completely because it was very kind of hard to do nice with the classical vector styles, and there were always like so many tricks to do it. And right now, when we kind of learned the tricks collectively, people started to pushing the boundaries to actually show it more. But the glow itself is not just enough. You have to make it thoughtful and you have to make it nice. And I feel like I figured out a couple of ingredients on how to make the glow nice. So one of the ingredients of many nice glows right now is that it goes from the bottom. The usual statement in the design, in graphic design, is that the light always comes from the top, where the sun is. This is kind of the sun, this is kind of the classical way of lighting any scene. But with digital design, in order to kind of highlight its digitalness, the objects itself, first of all, cast more light, and then if there is any light presence in the studio, in the composition, it always goes from below. And I can kind of clearly see it in the different backdrops. Even if they are fake, they are using this kind of, bottom is light and the up is dark. You can see right now, even the whole composition, if you squish your eyes, the bottom is usually lighter than the dark. You can see it again in different kind of, visual designs of how people design that the bottom lighting is kind of, makes it spark, but then the top remains the darker. And you can see it again and again. You can see like literally here's the brighter spot goes into the darker one. And many cases where this is actually true in almost every kind of imagery that I see and that I like, I see that effect. I have a couple of ideas of why it's happening. Again, as I mentioned, there's kind of like a protest against natural, and that's why kind of, we want to show it this way. You can see it even right now here in reflections, that I know this might be actually accidental, but again, the bottom of the image is bright, the top of the image is dark, and it gives this kind of more digital look to everything. And I feel like it's the reason why many of those things look so kind of modern, or like, very interestingly like shaped from the bottom. I really think there is something into that. You can see the cards, it happens everywhere. Again, you can see lighter and darker, and it's like almost like visible everywhere. Even in the mock-ups, you can see that the bottom is light and the top is dark. And again, like 10 years ago, it was kind of a bad way of doing mockups. Of course, this is not new or anything. There were different ways, but the classical things, it's kind of like switching over right now. But you can see that even individual elements have way more brightness right now. You can see the different graphs, the typography have its own shining, the objects in 3D. This is like this lighting, this couple of pixels on top of the device. It's kind of casting light that it shouldn't, right? It's literally the defect of the lens, of not clear lens or muddy lens, where the objects which the light's kind of, shining on them, they speculate with that light. This is not natural. This is designed. And this is kind of a design choice that is again being visible everywhere, and it's very interesting how it's kind of growing in all different directions here and there. Even this one, I like this word pattern by Webflow, the deep div, and basically this div also, you can literally see where the light goes. The light goes from down to up, and this is very interesting to me because again, it is very kind of almost like unconventional way of thinking about it. But things that are glowy, and for example, this, I think by Porter Rocha, this was one of my favorite elements, where they didn't only made an amazing contrast of this image. Like why this image works. I have a regular like display like, yes, it's Apple Studio, but it's like it shouldn't shine as bright as this. So why does this image work? It's because they added like pure black thing in the top. Again, they have like way lighter bottom, and then they have this kind of casting light from the kind of, from the image into the monitor that makes it feel more brighter than it is. It's whiter than white. And I feel like it's precisely because of those optical illusions of like, putting it into that specific background and in this specific direction of light. And I feel like, this is kind of important because the more kind of, you see how everything works, the more you see that everything that stands closer to the camera or stands closer, like, in different ways, it becomes lighter and it becomes more interesting to look at. And you can see that, something at the bottom is like quite light and then something at the bottom is quite dark. And it's happened again and again and again. Even in this kind of 3D renders, which are not really mixing media, but still, you can see that the top is slightly darker than the bottom. The top is slightly darker than the bottom. This is not, here, there is no such effect on background here, but guess what? The top of this main object is dark at the top and brighter object at the bottom. And I feel like it's also, it might be accidental, but it's still kind of very in this line of thinking type of stuff. There are also many other things where I see that the media are mixing itself with more math, science type of vibes, where you're making different kind of sketchy dot grid mechanics, blueprints, everything. It really have its own kind of new revival, and you can see the different medias are using the guiding lines or different kind of explanation of the math behind it. It's a really old trick, I admit it. There is nothing new about it, but I feel like it is getting more and more popular every day, and sometimes people innovate on that as well. For example, animating those lines, making the new finding of the math inside of some visual hierarchy, finding new, more kind of geometric shapes. There are all of the shapes are discovered, right? Even here you can see that, the circle is known, the triangle is known, or whatever the shape of the cursor is known. There is nothing like new about things, but finding new meanings for those shapes, rearranging them, playing with them mathematically as well, really gives kind of a new meaning towards it. And I was also kind of playing with a couple of designs for different interest maps that is right now visible on my website, and people seem to really like the idea of something that is touchable, something like more complicated than it is. Maybe it's also like a little bit of the kind of layering happening there, where you're trying to kind of understand what's happening. Like, you're trying to kind of almost think a little bit harder about something, which makes some images more nice to look at. And I feel like that's also might be the case for those type of things. But again, mixing different medias, you can already see it happening in the poster world, in different kind of graphic design world, in mixing some old, physical things with digital things, but not in exact way of skeuomorphism that was popular 15 years ago. This is something different. This is some way of other way of paying respect to mixing the media in kind of in a new world, where it almost looks like digital first and then some small application from the physical world, while before that it was actually vice versa. And you can see the different kind of different collaborations between designs and like branding agencies and different companies are also happening. By the way, very interestingly, the bottom is light, the top is dark. And I feel like you can see it again and again and again. Here's probably one of those differences where the bottom is dark, but I still like how this mockup is showing something through this kind of very weird angle of like, of not really showing the mockup like really in front, but like very further away on this kind of very stylish table. And I feel like there is also meaning to this. Again, nothing new, but we are seeing more and more of those very interesting mockups that are not quite classical in its sense. Like, this is not a classical mockup of the cream, or this is not a normal way of presenting the pencil, and this way is actually more expensive, and somehow we feel that way about this. And this is actually an example of treating the photography seriously and making those, for example, this harsh shadow usually would be a fall, it will be a fault for many photographers to do that. But unless it's intentional, and suddenly this photo makes total sense, and you can see the idea here in it. You feel like this box actually have more depth because of this shadow. You kind of feel like it's more tactile, and they matched the background with the box, so it kind of makes all sense. But even this lighting is not as trivial as as it looks like. It's not like minimal behind the scenes, and that it took some time to actually marry the digital, how it looks on the website and how it looks in the camera and how it looks in Photoshop and how it blends all together in the very end. Again, you can see different mixes of media where people are playing with isometrics, people are playing with photos, with rendering, with architecture style, and they're trying to mix all of those things together. Again, and coming back to some of the mathematical vibes, I feel like this also suddenly became more sexy, suddenly became more relevant. And I can see more and more of those kind of, tiny objects that are happening where if you're like very precise about something, it almost feels very, very appealing. And by the way, I don't know if I'm I'm definitely seeing it. You can see a very small glow around those arrows. And this is also not accidental. There could be no glow there, but they added this glow, and with this texture and everything, it really looks more mysterious, more serious, more rich, more curious. Where does it come from? What kind of product does it advertise? Who did it? And all of those things all together. And you can see that this kind of mixed media and stuff really getting caught into different representations of using something more dense. For example, paying homage to the small technical kind of lines and text on back of the physical devices. You can see that there is the whole aesthetics right now that's called micrographics, which is basically taking all of those small typography details and kind of reusing it for digital world. Again, not a kind of a new wave, but I feel like it's more like it was invented some time ago. People were using it, of course, but right now it has way more proliferation within more designers, and it still works as a case. It still looks appealing. It still looks like people are doing this, and people are like, I genuinely like this, and they want to screenshot it, or they want to kind of remember about it. So this is why I'm saying this. But also many times I actually noticed that even the small text itself, the more density is actually becomes more interesting as well. I feel like maybe it's because of the amount of text that we're processing or amount of information, but generally density stops becoming like a very anti-hero in the design world, where people were always trying to use the white space to surround everything, and sometimes it becomes a tool, like a visual tool as well, to almost like scare people away, but like saying it like, no, we're relevant because we actually want more things to show, and I feel like there is some kind of meaning to that as well. So I kind of like this, and I feel like there's definitely some place to be for it as well in the design world. Again, there are many types of how different again, this is very nice example of the lighting that goes from bottom to the top, and how here you can even see the reflection of the main ball that goes otherwise. I really like when the stop motion kind of design comes together. So I'm not sure, this is like not stop motion but like slow shutter rather. So this kind of different things are also basically a protest against very polished look, and something that would be very hard for AI to do. I've tried doing some, and of course this is a skill issue for me, not be able to try to one-shot it, but still I feel like something like this, where you have some kind of partial designs and kind of those kind of light strokes, are generally probably would be hard to do for AI. And you can kind of witness some of those kind of ideas of a person, and this, for example, would be a very hard thing to do for AI, because this kind of bending the laws of physics and bending the laws of the human kind of body, of how it works and how it works across the slow shutter, generating these arms where it goes like beyond, and that's what kind of camera captures, would be very hard to explain and recreate in AI. And I feel like that's why those images look appealing, and that's why it kind of looks Very nice, as well as, for example, Jana Boyko is like amazing artist. I have her art here, always bragging about it. But the idea of this kind of very handcrafted kind of strokes and how different they are, and the pick of the color and the unconventional kind of shapes and the way it kind of renders, it really kind of almost defends itself from the AI output. It looks like interesting. It looks like AI wouldn't make those kind of tiny wiggles that are like almost like unreasonable for some things. It would try to cut corners for its energy efficiency, and that's why it wouldn't go into some kind of different ways, or for example not painting some space to leave it for a pure white. And I feel like it's very, very important when artists kind of notice that and try to lean into those things where they can actually almost like staple their uniqueness in this industry in that way. I think across other lines, I'm kind of seeing different kind of again mixed medias of stuff where you can see those very kind of minimal looks, but again I feel like this comes back to the mock-up ideas. I feel like showing this type of merch, or showing the kind of this kind of very logical dots here on the coffee shop, or showing this kind of very interesting slashing the magazines into pieces. I feel like it's generally very, very interesting ways of of showing different information here. I think there's a couple of more like examples that I wanted to show. So I really like this image. I will tell why. So usually when you want to design the image like this, your first instinct would be to extrude the culture words as well. So what you would do, you would draw this kind of you would draw this spark icon, you would type culture and you would type it in 3D shape, and then you would give it like a couple of millimeters of weight to make it like maybe a little bit more like 3D. And here, this is where the interesting comes in. Interesting choice is to actually step back and say like, no, let the text be completely flat. And then the icon of Spark will actually gain even more weight near it. And that's why I feel like the compositions like this work, because they're not just taking the first idea that comes to mind regarding the 3D rendering, they're actually kind of reducing things to some kind of more interesting basics, where you're trying to play with the differences of different mediums. In this case, it's like, very, I don't know, I can't identify this font, but let's assume this is kind of very regular sans serif, like Inter or something. It's playing literally with that typography and heavy 3D rendering without mixing them too close. Because if it would be too close, it would be not as effective, not as cool as they're being different, and that contrast between this spark and between this E wouldn't have been created. And it happens more and more, you can see right here when, this kind of photo is very interesting, where, this kind of very neon shape and everything. There are many rules that are broken here, but it works together because there is a slight glow, because there is a slight silhouette, because there are like small highlights on different important parts where you want to highlight the features of the person, the lighting on the hair and stuff. And this is what makes it, more interesting and unconventional compared to all other kind of, all other ideas. Again, showing, for example, this is like one other example which I like a lot, where you show the craft. And this is like a very old trick where you take some kind of notebook and whenever you take a photo of a notebook, you put a pen like this and you take a photo with a pen, because it always looks more interesting with the pen. It almost looks like it's intentionally just written, and you're kind of, it's like freshly made bread compared to just bread. It's like taking the bread out of the oven and feeling the smell. The pan adds that. And I feel like seeing the tools of art is actually part of it. And I would even say more than that. We can see it right now in those kind of different examples where we see the cursors in the artwork. And I feel like the cursor is kind of the same plays the same role as the pen. It gives you this idea that it was just made for you or in front of your eyes, and that's why it's kind of worth more. And we can see that this proliferation of different, UI kind of design also spills everywhere. Even here you can see that the focus on this kind of interesting details in the UI, on making on this sliding, on making this kind of very interesting mock-ups, very aggressive angles, I would say. Like conventionally, you can see that this is the real UI part of the whole image. See this one. So compare it in the size to the whole image. The useful part of it is very, very small. But the image becomes very nice because of that. And this has been a very long time fight with the mock-ups of how aggressively angled they are, but I still feel like there is a reason of why this looks more aesthetically pleasing, just because of this light place on the device itself, just because you show something under some kind of angle, it gives it more depth, and people crave more depth. So I feel like generally, if I could kind of, draw the line of what is the current kind of the current kind of trending visual design, I would bet on a couple of things. The mixed media is a very strong contestant. The very unconventional mock-ups is strong contestant. Interesting from the bottom lighting is a contestant. Self-glowing objects is another one. I would say the kind of the un-AI, how to call it, like something that would be harder to do with AI, like slow shutter videos or handwritten illustrations are one of those. And I feel like micrographics, we will see more and more of those in those different instances. And I feel like the new wave of skeuomorphism, of bringing the digital first and then applying some of the taste from the old world, will be kind of something else. But generally, I feel like this is kind of a nice direction to go for the next couple of months. And I feel like I will actually play and create at least a couple of artifacts into each of these directions to prove that it's actually working as a recipe for me. And I will self-test myself if this is actually a recipe, or was I just foolish about noticing some false patterns across the way. Anyways, will not hold you longer. See you later. Bye-bye.